Gross domestic product growth overstates case. Last week's news that the economy is growing again produced a number of reports that the Great Recession is over. But even if that were true, what follows may be more painful than any economic recovery in living memory. So if the recession is over, then why does consumer confidence continue to fall? Why are home sales still going south again, and unemployment continuing to inch up and up? There are two possible explanations. One is that the recession isn't really over. Despite the high-fiving among economic forecasters over last week's report that the U.S. economy began expanding again in the third quarter, 1 quarter of growth is not enough to mark the end of a recession. And when you take a look inside the report, the 3.5% advance in the gross domestic product doesn't exactly point to an economy on the mend. Keep in mind that the government's first attempt at estimating the latest quarter of GDP, this number will be revised twice before it's considered final. The biggest gain, roughly 1 percentage point, came from vehicle sales, which surged during the widely popular now-ended Cash for Clunkers program. The rebound in the housing market, thanks to the first-time homebuyer tax credit that expires in November, added another 0.5 percentage point. Direct government spending added another 0.5%. Third quarter GDP also got a big boost, 0.9%, from a change in the level of inventories. To avoid getting stuck with piles of unsold goods, businesses continued cutting inventories in the third quarter. But because they've already cut to the bone, they did so at a slower pace in the third quarter. According to GDP math, that's a good thing. So, if you take out the growth that was directly or indirectly paid for by the government, along with the way GDP accounts for changes in inventories, the economy really only grew by just 0.4%. That's roughly the size of a typical revision by the time the final data is released. All of which means that most of the recovery in the third quarter was essentially a sugar high from one of the most aggressive government interventions in history. If the jolt from the stimulus simply moved up sales of cars and houses that would have happened later this year and next, all we will have done is created a hole in future GDP numbers. It also turns out that the stimulus, as big as it was, may not have been big enough. Approximately 1/3 of the $787 billion total went to tax cuts, much of which has only helped offset lost wages. Much of the rest is essentially going to fill a giant $360 billion hole in state budgets this year and next. So that leaves about $140 billion in incremental government spending, or 1% of GDP. When the impact of that government spending begins to wane next year, the hope is that other sectors of the economy, such as consumer spending and business investment, will kick in. But consumers don't yet seem ready or able to do a lot of spending. Two separate measures last week showed consumer confidence fail in October. Businesses continue to try to squeeze more profits from the same dollar of sales by cutting costs, which means they're spending less, not more. So even if they get in a spending mood, consumers don't have a lot of extra income to go shopping. The latest data shows that overall income was flat in September, despite the tax refund portion of the government's stimulus program. Without those transfers, wages and salaries fell 0.2%. After the last recession in 2001, some consumers made up for falling wages by borrowing against the equity in their homes or houses or running up credit card debt. That boost to consumer spending is now working in reverse, Credit has tightened considerably, and consumers are putting more money towards saving or paying down their credit cards to make up for the fallen value of their homes. Of course, there's another possible explanation for the mismatch between the economic data and public perception. Could the recession be over? Could the economy be growing weakly and unemployment will keep rising into next year? It's encouraging to see reports of an increase in housing construction, or industrial production, or car sales, but those gains are coming from extremely low levels. Sales of new single-family homes, for example, have been rising, but they're still at levels last seen in 1995. Worse, though job losses appear to be slowing, the total level of employment is lower than it was before the economy entered the last recession in 2001. In other words, all of the job growth for nearly an entire decade has been wiped out. Again, and this is important. In other words, all of the job growth for nearly an entire decade has been wiped out. When recessions end, it takes time for companies to start hiring again. Most want to see a convincing pickup for at least several months before they begin taking on new workers or opening new businesses. If we are indeed at the bottom of the trough, the question now is, how long will it take to make up for the damage done by the deepest contraction since the 1930s? When the last relatively mild recession ended in November 2001, the economy continued to shed jobs for nearly 2 years. It wasn't until February 2005 that the growing economy had replaced the 2.7 million jobs lost to the 2001 recession. But this time around, the job losses have been much more severe. Some 8 million jobs and counting. Once those job losses stop, if they do, it takes approximately 100,000 new jobs just to keep up with the growth of the workforce. That's added every month. During the last expansion, the economy created roughly 160,000 jobs a month. During the previous 1990s expansion, the longest in history, the economy created roughly 200,000 a month. So at that rate, it would take 6.5 years just to create enough jobs to keep up with the growth of the workforce and to replace the jobs lost to the recession. Even if this is the bottom, it will be years before the economy creates enough paychecks for consumers to once again add convincingly to the GDP. Until that happens, it will still feel like a recession, even if the data shows the economy is growing again. In other words, it's somewhat of an illusion of an economic recovery. It will take many years, if it happens at all, because there are fundamental changes taking place in the economies of the world. And also, there's something much bigger going on. This is part of a much bigger picture. And these are more signs of the end times. Transition days. Like I say, the transition is ongoing. It's happening. It's part of a process. There are many signs happening day by day all around the world.